The war in Europe was ending, but no one could agree on how. April 1945. The Rhine had been crossed. Berlin was burning. Eisenhower's forces were pushing east through shattered cities and burning forests, racing the Soviets to what was left of the Third Reich. Every day brought new surrenders. Entire divisions laying down arms in French villages, Bavarian valleys, Austrian crossroads, but communication was collapsing faster than the Wehrmacht. German commanders were still transmitting. Some wanted terms, some wanted time, some wanted to die with their rifles in their hands, and the Allies had no idea which was which. The problem wasn't equipment. By the spring of 1945, Allied signals intelligence had cracked most of the Reich's codes. Ultra-intercepts were flowing into Supreme Headquarters faster than analysts could read them. The problem was translation, because even when you intercept the message, even when you break the cipher, someone still has to understand what the words mean, and more importantly, what they don't mean. German military language was formal, layered, coded in tradition. A single phrase could carry a threat, a bluff, or a white flag depending on grammar, tone, and context. Surrender negotiations required fluency not just in German, but in the way German officers spoke to each other, the stiff Prussian syntax, the regional dialects, the difference between a Bavarian Feldwebel and a Berlin SS Standartenführer, and there weren't enough translators. Most of the Army's German speakers were Jewish refugees who'd fled in the 30s, men who'd learned English in New York tenements and joined up to go back and finish what Hitler started. They were brilliant, they were loyal, but their German was pre-war, academic, and in some cases marked by Yiddish inflections. That made Wehrmacht officers shut down the moment they heard it. The British had their own problems. MI6 had excellent linguists, but many were upper-class émigrés whose German sounded like 1920s Vienna, beautiful, but wrong for a front-line interrogation of a kid from Cologne who'd been eating tree bark for 3 weeks. So by late April, as the pace of surrender accelerated, Allied command faced a strange crisis. They were winning, but they couldn't talk to the people trying to quit. That's when the call went out for native speakers. Not refugees, not academics. Native speakers. People who grew up speaking German in German homes, who could code switch between High German and dialect, who understood not just the language but the culture of command. The problem, most of those people were still in Germany, or dead, or in camps. But there was one other group, German-American women. Before we go further, subscribe. Because every week we tell the stories of the wars that were fought in wire and static and grammar, where one misunderstood transmission could collapse a ceasefire or send bombers to the wrong coordinates. The engineering of war isn't just steel, it's syntax. In early 1945, the Women's Army Corps began a quiet recruitment push through Midwestern cities with large German populations. Milwaukee, Cincinnati, St. Louis, parts of rural Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. They weren't looking for soldiers. They were looking for voices. The pitch was subtle. Your language skills are needed for critical communications work in the European theater. No mention of combat. No mention of what communications work actually meant. Most of the women who signed up were second generation. Their parents had immigrated before the First World War, back when being German in America wasn't yet dangerous. They grew up speaking German at home, English at school. By the time Pearl Harbor hit, many had anglicized their last names, stopped speaking German in public, kept their heads down, but they still remembered the language, and now the Army wanted it back. They were sent to intelligence training schools in Maryland and Virginia, crash courses in radio operation, signals protocols, phonetic transcription, but the real training was linguistic. They studied Wehrmacht command structure. They learned how to recognize SS units by call sign. They practiced listening to scratchy field recordings of German officers giving orders, then translating them in real time. It was brutal work. The women weren't just learning a job, they were learning to think like the enemy, to anticipate not what a German soldier would say, but what he wouldn't say, the silences that meant defiance or desperation or mutiny. And then, in late April, the first group shipped out. Most were assigned to rear echelon signals units in France and Belgium, safe jobs, monitoring intercepted transmissions, transcribing interrogation tapes, but a few were pulled forward closer to the collapsing front, into the radio bunkers where live surrenders were being negotiated in real time. That's where the trouble started. Because while Allied command desperately needed fluent German speakers, Wehrmacht officers, especially older ones, especially SS, refused to surrender to a woman. It didn't matter that she was a translator, that she wasn't even making the decisions. The voice on the other end of the radio was female, and that was enough. Some would go silent. Some would demand to speak to a man. Some would switch to code and disappear back into the static. The Allies tried workarounds. Male officers would stand beside the women and repeat what they said. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it made things worse, because now the German on the other end knew he was talking to a woman, and that the Americans thought he was too stupid to notice. By early May, with Germany fracturing into isolated pockets of resistance, the need for real-time German negotiation was reaching a breaking point. Entire towns were trying to surrender, but local Wehrmacht commanders wouldn't cooperate unless the terms came through proper channels, in proper German, from someone they considered legitimate. And that's when Corporal Erika Schneider walked into the operations bunker in Regensburg, Bavaria, May 4, 1945. The city sat on the Danube, a medieval trading hub turned munitions center, now half destroyed by American bombing raids. The bridges were gone. The rail yards were rubble. But Wehrmacht elements were still dug in across the river. Fragments of the 17th Army, mixed with Volkssturm militia, a few SS diehards who'd been told Berlin was still holding. It wasn't. But no one had told them that in a language they believed. The American forward command post was in a wine cellar, beneath a bombed-out church. Radios lined the walls. Antennas jury-rigged through shattered masonry. The air smelled like wet stone and cigarette smoke, and the oil they used to keep the generators from seizing up. Officers crowded around maps, marking positions, trying to figure out which units. Across the river were real threats in which were just kids with rifles waiting for an excuse to quit. The radio operator on duty was a sergeant from Ohio. His German was decent, 2 years of night school, plus 6 months in Belgium listening to intercepts. He could read a decoded message, but live. Negotiation with a senior German officer in real time under pressure, that was different, and it was about to get worse. At 1100 hours, a transmission came through on an open Wehrmacht frequency. Clear signal, strong, no encryption. A voice, male, older, speaking High German with the crisp, clipped authority of Prussian officer training. This is General Major Dietrich von Klausen, commanding elements of the 17th Army east of Regensburg. I am prepared to discuss terms of capitulation under the Geneva Convention. I will speak only with an officer of equivalent rank. Acknowledge. The day. Bunker went still. Von Klausen wasn't a household name, but he was real. A career officer, old Wehrmacht, not SS, with a reputation for following orders and hating waste. If he wanted to surrender, it was legitimate. But he was also the kind of man who would walk away the second he felt disrespected. The American colonel in charge, a logistics officer from Pennsylvania who'd been awake for 30 hours, grabbed the handset. "This is Colonel Banning, United States Third Army. I am authorized to accept your surrender. Provide your current position and strength." Silence. Then von Klausen's voice, again colder. "Your translator has an American accent. I will speak with a German officer or I will not speak at all." Banning's jaw tightened. "There are no German officers here. This is an American command post. You're surrendering to us." Another pause. Then we have nothing further to discuss." The line went dead. They tried again at 1400 hours. Same frequency. This time they used a British liaison officer who'd studied at Heidelberg before the war. His German was flawless, grammatically, but it was academic, careful, and von Klausen heard it immediately. "You are not military. You are a school teacher." The Brit tried to salvage it. "I am a captain in His Majesty's forces, and I am offering you nothing. Do not contact this frequency again." Static. Banning slammed the map table. Outside, artillery was still thumping in the distance. American guns. Shelling suspected holdouts on the East Bank. Every hour that passed without a negotiated surrender meant more men dead, more buildings leveled, more civilians caught in the crossfire. Someone had to get through to von Klausen. That's when one of the junior signals officers, a lieutenant from Brooklyn who'd been monitoring the failed exchanges, spoke up. "Sir, we've got a WAC radio man who just rotated in from the intercept unit in Nuremberg. She's native Bavarian, grew up near Munich. Her file says she can do regional dialect." Banning looked at him like he'd suggested using a Ouija board. "He won't talk to a woman. He also won't talk to us. What do we lose?" Banning stared at the radio, then at the map, Then at the clock. Get her in here. Corporal Erika Schneider was 19 years old. She was 5'3", blonde, with a face that looked younger than her age, and a voice that didn't. She'd been in uniform for 8 months. Before that, she'd been a high school senior in a suburb of Milwaukee, daughter of a baker who'd left Bavaria in 1923 and never spoke about why. Her German was flawless because it had to be. Her father refused to speak English at home. He read her Grimm's fairy tales in the original. He made her practice verb conjugations at the dinner table. When she joined the WAC, she listed fluent German on her intake form, and a recruiter flagged it within a week. She'd spent the last 3 months in a signals unit in Nuremberg, transcribing intercepted Wehrmacht radio traffic. Most of it was chaos. Panicked orders, requests for ammunition that didn't exist, accusations of betrayal, desperate attempts to find out if Berlin was really gone. She'd heard men die over the radio. She'd heard them cry. She'd heard them execute deserters in the background while someone else kept transmitting. And now they wanted her to talk to a general. When she stepped into the bunker, she didn't salute. She just looked at Banning and waited. He gestured at the radio. German commander across the river. General Major. Wants to surrender but won't talk to us. He's old guard, formal. You think you can get through? Erika looked at the handset. What do you need him to do? Lay down arms. Pull back to a staging area. Let us cross without resistance. Standard terms. She nodded. What if he asks for guarantees? We'll honor Geneva. He'll be treated as a POW, not a war criminal. His men get food and medical care. And if he doesn't believe me? Banning met her eyes. Then we shell his position until there's nothing left to surrender. Erika picked up the handset. Herr Generalmajor, hier ist das amerikanische Hauptquartier Regensburg. Her voice was steady, clear, with the soft vowels and rolled consonants of southern Bavaria. Not Munich, too urban. Not Austrian, too melodic. Somewhere in between. The kind of German you'd hear in a village church, or a farmhouse kitchen, or a garrison town where officers' daughters grew up learning to speak. Properly, the radio hissed. Then von Klausen's voice came back cautious. Wer spricht? Who is speaking? Erika didn't hesitate. Corporal Schneider. Ich übersetze für Colonel Banning, Dritte Armee. Corporal Schneider. I am translating for Colonel Banning, Third Army. Silence. Longer this time. The men in the bunker were frozen. Banning's hand hovered near the handset, ready to take over if this collapsed. The signals officer who'd suggested her looked like he was holding his breath. Then von Klausen spoke again, and his tone had changed. Schneider, wo kommen Sie her? Schneider, where are you from? It wasn't a tactical question. It was personal. He was testing her. Erika closed her eyes for a second, then answered. Mein Vater kommt aus Rosenheim. Ich bin in Amerika aufgewachsen, aber wir haben zu Hause immer Deutsch gesprochen. My father is from Rosenheim. I grew up in America, but we always spoke German at home. Another pause. Then quieter. Rosenheim. Ich kenne Rosenheim. I know Rosenheim. And just like that, the wall came down. Not all the way, but enough. Von Klausen's voice was still formal, still controlled, but there was something else now. Recognition. Not of her, but of the language she carried. The same language he'd grown up with, the same syntax, the same cadence. She wasn't a foreign interrogator. She was a German speaker who happened to be on the other side, and that changed everything. Corporal Schneider, he said slowly. Ich habe keine Lust, meine Männer für eine verlorene Sache zu opfern. Aber ich muss wissen, dass sie anständig behandelt werden. Corporal Schneider, I have no desire to sacrifice my men for a lost cause, but I must know they will be treated decently. Erika glanced at Banning. He nodded. She keyed the mic again. Herr Generalmajor, Colonel Banning gibt Ihnen sein Wort. Genfer Konvention wird eingehalten. Ihre Männer bekommen Essen, ärztliche Versorgung und werden als Kriegsgefangene behandelt, nicht als Verbrecher. General, Colonel Banning gives you his word. Geneva Convention will be honored. Your men will receive food, medical care, and will be treated as prisoners of war, not as criminals. She paused, then added something Banning hadn't said, but something she knew a Bavarian officer needed to hear. Und es wird kein unnötiges Blutvergießen mehr geben. And there will be no more unnecessary bloodshed. The line crackled. Then von Klausen said very quietly, Gut, ich stimme zu. Good, I agree. They worked out the details over the next 2 hours. Erika stayed on the radio the entire time, translating back and forth between von Klausen and Banning. She never gave orders. She wasn't authorized to. But she shaped the language in ways that made the orders sound less like a demand and more like a negotiation between professionals. When Banning said, "You will disarm your men and move them to Grid Square Echo 4 by 1800 hours, Erika translated it as, "Colonel Banning bittet Sie, Ihre Truppen zu entwaffnen und bis 18 Uhr in den Bereich Echo 4 zu verlegen. Colonel Banning asks you to disarm your troops and relocate them to Area Echo 4 by 1800 hours. The meaning was the same. The tone wasn't. Von Klausen responded with formal precision, outlining his unit strength, confirming routes, asking for clarification on medical evacuation for his wounded. Erika translated every word, never paraphrasing, never editorializing, but her presence, her voice, kept the conversation from collapsing into ultimatums. At one point, von Klausen asked a question that made the bunker tense up. "Corporal Schneider, sind Sie auch Soldaten? Corporal Schneider, are you also a soldier?" It was a trap. If she said yes, he might argue she had no authority. If she said no, he might dismiss her as a civilian. She answered carefully, "Ich diene in der Women's Army Corps. Ich bin der Nachrichtenaffizierin. I serve in the Women's Army Corps. I am a communications specialist." Von Klausen was quiet for a moment. Then, "Verstehe, I understand." And that was it. He never questioned her authority again. By 1730 hours, the first Wehrmacht soldiers began appearing on the west bank of the Danube. They came in small groups, rifles slung, helmets off, hands visible. American MPs moved forward to disarm them, checking for SS insignia, separating officers from enlisted men. Medical units set up triage stations. Field kitchens started heating rations. Von Klausen himself arrived just before 1800, driven in a staff car under white flag. He was in his 60s, gray-haired, with the straight-backed posture of a man who'd spent 40 years in uniform. He surrendered his sidearm to Colonel Banning without ceremony, then asked to speak to the translator. Banning nodded. "She's inside." Erika stepped out of the bunker into the late afternoon light. She still had her helmet on, her field jacket buttoned to the neck. She looked like exactly what she was, a teenage corporal in an army that hadn't existed 3 years ago. Von Klausen stared at her for a long moment. Then he came to attention and gave a slight bow. "Danke, Fräulein Schneider." "Thank you, Miss Schneider." Erika didn't bow back. She saluted. Von Klausen returned it. Then he was escorted away by MPs, and she never saw him again. The Regensburg surrender was one of dozens happening across southern Germany that first week of May. By the 7th, the Wehrmacht had collapsed entirely. By the 8th, the war in Europe was over. Erika Schneider's role in it was never publicized. There was no medal ceremony, no mention in dispatches. The official after-action report credited effective liaison with enemy command elements, but didn't name her. She stayed in Germany through the summer of 1945, working in signals intelligence units that shifted from combat operations to occupation. She translated interrogation transcripts. She helped process millions of POWs. She listened to hours of intercepted radio traffic from SS units still hiding in the Alps, convinced the war wasn't really over. And she kept speaking German, because even in peace, the Allies needed translators. But the work had changed. In the last days of the war, translation was about survival, stopping the killing, getting men to lay down their guns, finding a way to communicate across the space between enemies. After the war, it became something else. Bureaucracy, denazification tribunals, legal proceedings, reconstruction. The urgency was gone. The stakes were still there, but they moved slower. By the fall, Erika requested a transfer home. She was discharged in December 1945 and went back to Milwaukee. Her father had died while she was overseas. She finished high school, then enrolled in a teacher's college. She never talked about the war. But 50 years later, in a 1995 oral history interview with the Library of Congress, she described the moment in the bunker when von Klausen asked where she was from. "I realized he wasn't asking because he didn't trust me," she said. "He was asking because he wanted to know if I understood what he was losing. And I did, because my father lost it too, when he left Germany. You can't translate that. You just have to carry it. The engineering of trust is invisible. You can't blueprint it. You can't test it in a lab. You can't build it out of steel or rubber or radio wire. It lives in grammar, in accent, in the way a sentence is shaped, so it sounds like respect instead of surrender." In the last days of World War II, the Allies had more firepower than any military in history. They had air superiority, armor, logistics, intelligence. But they couldn't make German officers stop fighting until someone spoke to them in a language they recognized. Not just the words, but the way those words were supposed to sound. That's what Erika Schneider built. Not a translation. A bridge. And the thing about bridges is they're only useful if both sides believe they'll hold. Von Klausen believed it because her German was real. Not learned in a classroom. Not reconstructed from intelligence files, but inherited. The kind of German that carried the weight of kitchens and churches and villages that no longer existed. She didn't lie to him. She didn't flatter him. She just spoke the language the way he needed to hear it, and that was enough to make him believe the promise that came with it, that surrender didn't have to mean humiliation, and that saved lives. Not thousands, not enough to change the outcome of the war, but enough to matter. The men who walked across that river in Regensburg on May 4, 1945 went home eventually, some to war crimes trials, some to prison, camps in Siberia, some to farms in Bavaria where they buried their uniforms and never spoke about the war again. But they went home alive. After the war, the Women's Army Corps was quietly dissolved, then resurrected, then integrated into the regular army in 1978. The women who served as translators, interrogators, and signal specialists were eventually recognized, decades later, as part of the intelligence apparatus that won the European theater. But their work was never cinematic. There were no dramatic photos of women at radios, no newsreels, no monuments, just personnel files and after-action reports and the occasional oral history recorded 50 years too late. Erika Schneider never went back to Germany, but her children did. 2 daughters who studied abroad in Munich in the 1970s and brought back photos of Rosenheim, where their grandfather had been born. The town looked nothing like he'd described. The old churches were still there, but everything else had been rebuilt. The war had passed through it twice, once going east, once retreating west, and left it flattened. But people still spoke Bavarian German, still used the same formal greetings, still shaped sentences, the way Erika's father had taught her to shape them, back in a Milwaukee kitchen in the 1930s. Language doesn't die the way cities die. It bends, it hides, it waits, and sometimes, when the world is ending and no one knows how to stop it, the right voice in the right language is the only engineering that matters.